Welcome. My name is Tomasz Kamiński. I'm a professor at University of Łódź, and today I have a pleasure and honor to host the meeting with Adam Gopnik. He's a liberal essayist and writer in the New Yorker, more than 30 years now, and author of 9 books, including Thousand Small Sanities, the one that we are going to discuss with him today. The book is probably the best I read. This year, and by far the best defense of liberalism I have ever read. So, Adam, thank you very much for joining Freedom Games today.
The only thing that could make me happier would be to actually be with you in Poland for this discussion. That's a trip I've never had the opportunity to make, and it's a trip I'm desperate to make. If I have two heroes in the world, they are Szymborska, the great poet, who is my favorite poet, and as I've mentioned, I'm hugely honored that I sort of share a name with the great Adam Michnik, whose work as a dissident thinker has always inspired me. So I wish I was with you physically in Poland this morning, but I'm glad to be, or this evening. I'm delighted to be with you virtually.
Okay, let me start our conversation with a question about the election in U.S. You start your book with a conversation with your daughter Olivia just after the election 4 years ago. She was in despair after Trump victory. How your conversation looked like a few days ago?
Well, it's fascinating, Tomasz, because my daughter, who was to my left when I was writing this book somewhat, has now transited over to my right. And she, certainly not a Trumpite, but she warned me on Monday, the day before the election, that it was going to be very close, that Trump was going to be much more formidable than the polls were suggesting. And she turned out to be right. So the conversation we had, though, was one of those, how do you weigh it? In other words, there's an very optimistic way of seeing the election results, which is that Trump was ejected from power. Millions more people voted against Trump than for Trump. And from my point of view, as a liberal thinker, what was assembled was an extraordinary coalition of kinds, from left-wing socialists to right-wing ex-Republicans, who gathered together consciously and empirically to eject Trump. The negative or the pessimistic version of it, which Olivia is, I think, a little more inclined to, is that Trump got 70 million plus votes. He, instead of losing his hold on the American right wing, he reaffirmed his hold on the American right wing. And that what we were hoping naively might be the final battle has turned out to be one more skirmish in the war. I should add, though, I well remember that talking to Italian friends when all of this was happening in 2016, I was in Rome for a literary conference. And one of the points that they made again and again is that they had been through something similar with Berlusconi, but that everyone had thought once Berlusconi was gone, sanity would be restored. And that isn't what happened. That what came after Berlusconi, in some ways, was less threatening because less consolidated, but even crazier. The right wing that emerged after Berlusconi was loonier than Berlusconi himself, and I fear that may be the case here. But I think both Olivia and I had the sense that we escaped by the skin of our teeth, to use that expression, and at least we escaped.
Yeah, okay, but it might be only a window of opportunity for 4 years, exactly. And not the change of the trend.
No,
okay,
not at all.
Coming back to your book, let's start with the title, Thousand Small Sanities, the Moral Adventure of Liberalism. I know that was not your first idea of the title of the book. I know that you proposed the rhinoceros manifesto as a
Yes.
title, and there is a great love story with
Attached to the,
Cage in the book, and also the great comparison between rhinoceros and unicorns.
yes,
Could you please
of course.
Of
Course.
present it?
So my original title for the manuscript was The Rhinoceros Manifesto, and my publisher, exactly as you say, said it's going to be too hard to explain to people. Each time somebody you're interviewed, you'll have to explain from the beginning. So, but I'll explain why I wanted to call it that, and I should add that the book is titled that in Italian. The Italian edition is the one edition that's called The Rhinoceros Manifesto. It relates to the subtitle, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. One of my ambitions in this book was to treat liberalism, as I understand it, the chain of thinkers and actors who have created the liberal, humanist, democratic tradition, not as dry thinkers about bicameral legislatures and autonomous individuals, but as participants in a great moral adventure, people who lived lives that thrilled to liberal ideas. And crucial to that project was the image, the example of John Stuart Mill, the great English philosopher of liberalism, I think by general assent, the greatest of all liberal thinkers, and the woman he loved and credited as his teacher, Harriet Taylor. And when Mill and Taylor met, she was married, and they had a clandestine love affair in the 1830s. And they would meet secretly to exchange ideas and hold hands. And one of the places that they loved to meet was in front of the rhinoceros cage at the London Zoo. The rhinoceros, I found out later, had only arrived in London in 1826. And with the acuity that only intellectuals have, they realized that everyone in the zoo would be looking at the rhinoceros and no one would be looking at the lovers on the bench. And it was on that bench and benches like it that they exchanged the ideas that would lead to what are, for me, the two foundations of liberal thinking. John Stuart Mill's great book on liberty, which she supported and assisted, and her great book on the subjection of women, which he supported and assisted. And for me, Thomas, those are the two pillars because, to put it simply, On Liberty, John Stuart Mill's great book, which we should all reread every year, is the most absolute statement of total freedom of expression, our right to mock, to blaspheme, to argue. No idea is beyond inspection, no faith is beyond criticism, and so on. And the book that they wrote together that had her imprint on it, on the subjection of women, is a book about social action. It's a book about taking massive social action to remedy a great wrong, the subjection of women. And so their work together is both about the affirmation of individual freedom, but it's also about the necessity of social action. And those two ideas coming together are what make liberalism, as I understand it, distinct from conservatism, distinct from what we in America call libertarianism. It's what gives the liberal tradition its force. And in thinking about the pair of them sitting on that bench outside the rhinoceros cage, exchanging these ideas, I realized that the rhinoceros was the perfect symbol for liberalism, the heraldic animal of liberalism. Because what, after all, is a rhinoceros? A rhinoceros is the original real-world form of the unicorn. The reason that the mythology of the unicorn spread throughout Europe in the medieval period is that travelers went to Africa, saw a rhinoceros, but thought, it's a bit ugly, it's not very glamorous, and they came back and they cosmeticized it into the legend of the unicorn, this beautiful creature with a silver coat and a perfect long horn. When the reality is that the rhinoceros is an ugly creature with a blunt horn, squat, and it lives in mud. But in comparing those two animals, the unicorn is like utopian political thinking. It's beautiful, it's ideal, and it does not exist. The rhinoceros is like liberal political thinking. It's often ugly, it's squat, it isn't glamorous, but it exists and it is formidable. So for me, taking on the rhinoceros as the symbolic animal of liberalism was both a tribute to John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, but it was also for me a way of affirming the necessity of ugliness to the liberal tradition. Liberalism is anti-utopian thinking at every turn. It doesn't, not only does it not propose an ideal order that awaits us somewhere in the future, but it aggressively rejects the idea of an ideal order. It says our job is remedying injustice and cruelty as we see them in the world. Our job is pushing forward to make the society we inherit a bit better than it was 20 minutes ago or a week ago. It's not to envision an ideal unicorn and try to turn real rhinoceroses into those unicorns. So that, at length, was the reason I made it the Rhinoceros Manifesto.
Your book is a great defense of liberalism, liberalism that is engaged in the two-front war. On one hand with left-wingers, on other hand with right-wingers. Let's start with right-wingers. And in your book, you mentioned a few conservative ideas with sympathy, in a sense. Idea of natural order and family or community, and liberal reforms might be enemy of this. You mentioned conservative reverence for religion, and liberal secularism is an enemy of this. And you also mentioned identity and nationalism, national identity versus liberal cosmopolitanism. That is an enemy of this. How you defend liberalism against right-wing, let's say, adversaries?
Yes. Well, first of all, I did try, and if there's one thing that I am, you will forgive an author's vanity, but the one thing I am proud of in this book is that I invested myself, not just intellectually, but emotionally, in the attacks on liberalism. This is a very liberal thing to do, to make them credible, not to make them cartoons or caricatures. And exactly as you say, I think that the right-wing attack on liberalism is above all an attack on an undue faith in reason, that human existence can't simply be reduced to the rational search for utility, to use John Stuart Mill's phrase. And I try to turn to many of the genuinely great conservative thinkers who realize that we cannot imagine ourselves as limited individuals. I give the example of a great Canadian conservative and Catholic thinker, Roman Catholic thinker, Charles Taylor, who says the problem with liberalism is that liberals always ask, what do I want? When the real human question is, where am I? How am I related to other people in my world? I don't exist as an individual with wants and desires exclusively. That's an incredibly degraded view of humanity. Oh, I want things. It turns humankind into consumers, into narrow materialists, empty materialists. And that's a very powerful thought. I'm sure in Poland you live with it every day in a very powerful and intimate way. So how do you respond to that? Because it obviously has a powerful element of truth in it. Human beings live in communities. Human beings need community. I give the instance in the book, because I feel it in my heart, of Olivia, my daughter, and I going out to dinner to celebrate her getting high marks on an entrance exam. And we sit there together while there's a huge table of a united family, 4 generations sitting at the next table. And it's enviable, that sense of continuity through time, continuity in faith. So how do we respond to it? Well, there are 2 central ways I want to respond to it. One is to say what I believe to be true, that in no societies has there been such a breadth of possibility for the practice of faith as in liberal societies. I give the example, one of the things I love to do is to go, I live in Manhattan, I go across the river to Brooklyn on a Friday night, and you see all of the huge number of Jewish sects, particularly, many of them emigrated from Poland, the Lubavitchers, the Satmars, and so on, all of them not only free to practice their faith, but free to engage in their community, free to realize themselves, not just religiously, but as a human community. I should add parenthetically that we're paying an enormous price for that right now in New York, because they have such powerful community practices, they're not very good at social distancing, and the virus rises in those communities. But in any case, it is simply false to say that there is any barrier in a healthy liberal society against the practice of faith. On the contrary, exactly because liberal societies depend on pluralism and tolerance, there's a possibility of a much broader room for the practice of faith. And then one of the truths about the United States is that it's a place for religious experiment, Mormonism, the Shakers, and Scientology, and so on. What liberal societies prevent is the exclusive practice of a faith. If your idea of faith and community is exclusive to you and to your group, then it's true that a liberal order is not a welcoming place. But if you want to practice faith, a liberal society welcomes it. It doesn't limit it at all. And in addition, I think this is a crucial point, liberal societies depend on community. They just don't depend exclusively on inherited community. They don't just depend exclusively on traditional community. One of the things that happens in every liberal society is that communities are made, new families are formed out of different kinds of people. I'm a Canadian who came to New York 40 years ago because I wanted to escape my own background and find my own community here in New York of people who cared passionately about avant-garde art and the practice of literature and so on. That's not a rejection of community, that's a creation of community. And that's crucial to the liberal order. One of the crucial points I wanted to make in the book is that the idea of liberal individualism is a terrible libel of the real liberal tradition, which depends exactly on the idea of creating community. So, long-winded answer, but the two things I'd say that the liberal response to the right-wing critique is to say, first, that we believe in the free practice of religion, in the open practice of faith. We just don't believe in the exclusive practice of religion. And secondly, that we believe powerfully in community. Cosmopolitanism is a way of forming new community.
But right-wing, especially in Polish context, right-wing movements are very much linked to authoritarianism and also anti-intellectualism. And I found an interesting quotation in your book that, because you mentioned this point as well, and you mentioned those damned elites with their damned ideas. And the argument is always the antidote to fanatism. Is it really?
Well, the truth, it's a losing. One of the things that's important for me in this book is that I didn't want to write a book of political recommendations. I wanted to write a book of values, discussing values and offering values, because I think part of the necessary understanding of liberalism is that we live in a tragic world. We live in a fallen world. Liberalism is not optimistic in the sense it says everything will work out. And one of the truths that we recognize is that there will be many battles that we lose. And argument will not always persuade or never persuade the authoritarian. In the long run, all that we have between anarchy on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other is the practice of argument. And as we look around the world with all the things that are discouraging and even at times sources of despair, in America, in Europe, nonetheless, we see that there is a space being created all the time for argument, for conversation, for discussion. With all, I think my friends in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, I think would agree with me that with all of the setbacks and all of the disappointments of the post-Cold War period in Europe, there nonetheless has been created a space for argument, a space of civic engagement, a new kind of social capital. It isn't perfect, it isn't ideal, but it exists. That's the rhinoceros notion. And of course, we've seen it, to come to something that I'm sure your listeners want to talk about. We've seen it, I think, with just this election in the United States a week ago. It was very disappointing in some ways. We were hoping for an overwhelming rejection of Trump and Trumpism, and instead we got a limited rejection of Trump and Trumpism. But if you ask what did that rest on? It turns out, as far as anyone can tell by analyzing the results, it didn't rest on some huge wave of revulsion coming from the population, the populace, the people. It came from a lot of people in many, many different strata being persuaded that Trump was a bad guy. There was one thing that won this election. It was all of those suburban women outside of Detroit and outside of Milwaukee and outside of Philadelphia who normally would vote for Republicans, who did vote for Republicans elsewhere on their ballot, senators and congressmen, but who were repelled by the authoritarianism of Trump, who were sufficiently repelled to vote against him. They were, in plain English, persuaded, they were argued into the belief by their experience that though they were sympathetic to many elements of a right-wing agenda, they could not be sympathetic to the utter ugliness of Trump's authoritarianism. When I say argument counts, that's all I mean, is that it's possible to create that small but very real space for persuasion, which enabled us to eject Trump last week.
Okay, let's move to the left-wing critique of liberalism, because it's in Polish context is probably the most important the most important one. The discussion between liberals and the left wingers. In Poland, liberalism is attacked from the left. That liberalism is for rich men, for sure. For those who are capital owners, I mean financial capital as well as symbolic capital, of course, and liberalism is for those who exploit poor people. And sometimes, of course, export even those atrocities and exploitation outside Europe. So for business generally, and the major offense that the left wingers use is that you are a neoliberal. So you are for free market doctrine that in which the GDP growth is a god, or at least is the single most important goal of the humanity, and this is a central argument between left wingers and liberals in Poland. What would you answer to such arguments?
Well, first of all, not in Poland alone. It's exactly the central argument in America, in Canada, in France, and elsewhere. And neoliberal, you're exactly right, is the charge. You always know when a word has little meaning because it's not a word you adapt about yourself, right? Heretics, always have given names by the people who think that they are heretics. I've never known anybody who identifies as a neoliberal. I know lots of people who identify as liberals, no one who identifies as a neoliberal. But nonetheless, it brings attention to a central tension in liberal thought, and that is the relationship between political liberalism and economic liberalism, between parliamentary politics, the open society, and free markets, open markets in that way. And what I'd say is that the relationship, and this is one of the points I try to make in the book, is much more complicated than the simple notion that, what liberalism really means is the freedom of the capitalist to exploit. Let me give you two instances, one historical and one contemporary, to indicate what I mean. Historically, one of the fascinating things is that Adam Smith, who's often taken to be the father of free market economics, in fact, if you examine his thought, is by no means an enthusiast, an uncritical enthusiast for free markets. His thought rests on the idea not that markets make men free, but that free men and women can move towards markets. That if we have a society in which people have the capacity for social trust, if they have what he called a spark of sympathy for each other, then it's very natural for them to be able to trade and barter and engage in markets without fear. And that the move from a monopoly to the free market is a move from being a member of a clan to being a citizen of a country. But for Smith, the social solidarity always has to precede the free market. And if you don't have social solidarity, then you just have a conspiracy of rich people. He's very clear about that. And we've seen in Russia how if you don't have social trust, if you don't have rich social capital, and you introduce free markets, all you get is kleptocracy. All you get is an oligarchy. So in truth, it seems to me that the relationship of political liberalism to free market liberalism is complex, and that we can be political liberals and still be highly skeptical of an unregulated free market. I tend to think it works the other way. In now coming to more or less contemporary terms, as you know, when the great social democratic movements of Europe were coming to fruition after the Second World War, one of the things that conservatives, right-wingers said often, Friedrich von Hayek is a perfect example, said is, you will not, if you move towards social democracy, to socialism, you will not be able to sustain political liberalism. And it turned out to be false, that in Britain above all, but in France and in the Scandinavian countries, it turned out to be perfectly possible to have a highly regulated welfare state which still preserved all of the institutions of political liberalism, including the possibility of throwing out the Social Democrats and replacing them with conservatives. So the idea that there's an incompatibility between political liberalism, elections, freedom of expression, freedom of argument, and social democracy simply turns out to be false. So I say that as a social democrat, that, and this is a little pedantic maybe, but I think it's crucial. The great movements for social democracy in Europe and Canada all depended on accepting and embracing and internalizing the tradition of political liberalism, not on rejecting it. Whereas all of the hugely destructive utopian movements for revolutionary change in Russia, in China, and elsewhere, the Marxist revolutions, all involved a rejection of the institutions of political liberalism, and all were, without exception, catastrophes. So I think that there's the liberal response to the leftists is to say, look at history. All of the reforms that you think are essential can be achieved through concerted action with liberal institutions. And when you discard liberal institutions in search of your revolutionary change, it produces moral and economic disaster.
Yeah, and this is a very important distinction that you make between liberals and the leftists. The left wingers believe in a revolution, and the liberals believe rather in reforms.
Yeah, I think that, yes, exactly. I say in the book, the right-wing attack on liberalism is an attack on the idea of reason, the notion that reason is enough, and the left-wing attack on liberals is an attack on the idea of reform. Reform isn't enough, we need revolution. And yes, I think that making a steady distinction between liberals and leftists is very important, because it's a distinction that gets conflated. Also, let's add, because liberals and leftists often work in harmony. We are parts of one coalition, even though we have very different ideological inheritance.
One more thing that I found particularly interesting in your book is a hate speech topic, and you wrote that preventing the harm to minorities caused by hate speech justify limiting freedom of speech, and then you ask the question, who are the judges to decide what harm can come to a minority? So, for example, when I recommend a book to my students to read, for example, the book of about I don't know, participation of some Poles in the Holocaust. Okay, of course, it might harm some feelings of minority of my students, but the question is where we should put the borders, because this is a very important discussion on the American universities as well as European universities. Should we let, for example, the Holocaust denialists to universities to give lectures? And what about, for example, pro-life activists? Okay, where to put the border?
It's one of the most complicated questions, and we shouldn't avoid complicated questions. And it comes up in every frame. I lived in France for many years, and there, of course, the question is pressing on everyone right now. There, it's a question of cartoons that make fun of the Prophet Muhammad. In Poland, it's a question of telling ugly truths about the Polish role in the Holocaust. In America, it often takes the opposite lane. We don't want to hear about slavery, or we want to hear only one history of slavery, and so on. So it's a terribly complicated question. As I say, I come originally from Canada, and Canada has a very complicated legal and judicial framework for dealing with the problem of hate speech. And to make a complicated story somewhat simpler, I think that the distinction we always have to make is between insults to an ideology and threats to people. That those are two very different things. We must have the freedom to insult each other's ideology, to insult, including religious ideology, to insult Catholicism, to insult Islam, to insult liberalism. That's part of the necessary give and take that John Stuart Mill defines so well, not only because we have reluctant tolerance, but also because we have ambitious or engaged tolerance. We understand that only through the clash of ideas can we begin to understand what's true and what isn't. At the same time, we don't want to have tolerate speech that incites violence against particular people. The laws in Canada against hate speech try to make that distinction and say it's one thing to be a critic of Jewish theology. That's something everyone has a right to be. It's another thing to offer speech that tends to lead to violence against Jews or Poles or Catholics or whomever. Those are hard distinctions to make, right? And I think that the only thing we can do is to say, in each case, we're going to examine it. In each case, we're going to argue about it. I think that that's one more case where I called the book when I couldn't call it the Rhinoceros Manifesto, I called it 1,000 Small Sanities, because I wanted to bring attention to the non-existence of one great plan or one great solution to countless issues. Saying that we have to argue these things out one by one is not a way of evading the issue, but a way of drawing our attention to the reality that each issue in the question of free speech is going to be different from the next one. I can say with some certainty that the cartoons of Muhammad in Charlie Hebdo and in France were ugly in lots of ways, but they were also insults to Islamic ideology and therefore ought to be protected. I can tell you that there are people in America who spread libels about Muslims, that they're planning to impose Sharia law tomorrow on New York City, that should be discouraged. I don't know whether they should be prohibited or not. Myself, I tend to be something of an absolutist in the tradition of John Stuart Mill, that all thought and all expression should be free, and then should be free to be argued against. But I recognize that that's not necessarily the only position a liberal can take.
Another point of attack from the left wingers is a more contemporary one. is attack that comes from people engaged in environmental issues, and this triangle between economic growth, inequalities, and our planetary boundaries. I mean, climate change, biodiversity. It's very hard to find a balance, and. This year, I also read the book of Kate Raworth, Donut Economy. I don't know if you are
Yes.
familiar with this book, and she argued for a revolutionary change in the perception of economic development, that the growth is no longer our aim. Our aim is to give prosperity for all and reduction of our ecological impact, not to cross our planetary boundaries. And this is a very challenging attack on the liberal way of perception of the world, or liberal way of perception of economy.
Yes, well, I will be honest with you, that kind of attack, and I'm familiar with it, always makes me a bit impatient, because what does it really mean? Now, I happen to share many of those values. You know, I'm in my other, the other hats I wear is someone who writes a great deal about food and sustainable agriculture and all of those things. I'm totally in favor of them. And Americans eat too much meat, which is bad for their health and it's bad for the planet. I would like to see that changed. I'm entirely for it. But the only way you can arrive at those changes, those revolutionary changes, is through the process of persuasion. Think about what it actually means, and it makes me impatient because there's such a lack of realism. What are you going to do? You're going to impose those views on other people who are unwilling to change their own lifestyle because you're convinced of your own righteousness? We have a long history in the 20th century of people who are convinced of their own righteousness imposing a revolutionary view on other people. There inevitably will be dissent against your view. And then the only real important question is, how are you going to deal with dissent? Are you going to recognize it? Are you going to allow the dissenters the chance to put their view forward in the search for political power? Or are you going to repress that dissent? Once you're in the business of repressing dissent, you're in the totalitarian game again. And that's when the Ukrainian kulaks get murdered and the Ukrainian people get starved, and it's a whole host of horrors that happen. So I'm totally sympathetic with those views, but I am completely impatient with the idea that because my view is right, I therefore have the right to impose it on people who disagree with it. Every view that we can possibly put forward, whether it's a specific view about ecology or a broader view about faith, will meet dissent. And the test of a political idea is not how righteously it makes you feel, but how you intend to cope with the opposition to that idea. And the notion that somehow there will be a religious awakening in which everyone will agree with you is the core of what I call unicorn thinking. It's the core of the kind of intolerant utopianism that created such moral catastrophes in the 20th century. And so whenever someone says, we don't have time for reform, we have to have a revolution, I just want to say, sit down and examine history, and you will see why that is a very, very destructive idea.
One of the greatest problems of liberals in Poland is how to appeal with liberalism to younger generation. And I know that my teenage son Adam is watching this, and I would like to ask you how to explain to this generation, young people. You know, nobody is born as a liberal.
No.
Liberalism is quite a modern way of thinking. How to make liberalism appealing to younger generation?
Well, one of the things I tried to do in this book was to remind the younger generation how much heroism was attached to the liberal tradition. It's natural you tend to think, well, radicals, Che Guevara, or pick your hero, have the glamour because they're confident, intolerant, romantic. Liberalism does not seem to be a romantic idea, and young people are properly all of us are properly attracted to that romanticism. You say in your family, hello, Adam, another Adam. In my family too, right? We had this ongoing argument. I have my son Luke is my daughter's to my right, my son is to my left, and he was, we had an ongoing argument. I'm putting this in very specific terms about Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden. This went on all through the first half of the year. And he said, oh, only Bernie Sanders can defeat Trump because he'll bring all of these youngsters, all this youth forward. And we don't need to persuade the Trump voters. We just need to inspire the non-voters to do it. And now, as he admits readily, that's been proven to be false. In order to eject Trump, which we all agreed was our primary goal, it turned out that you needed a broad coalition of very different kinds. The idea that there was some way that you could avoid the hard work of persuading the people who didn't agree with you in order to get your way turned out to be false. And once again, utopian revolutionary thinking proved to be a dead end, while the hard work of rhinoceros reform and persuasion proved to be a way of getting the essential work done of ejecting Trump. There's obviously a sense in which radicals and liberals have to work together. Liberals always run the risk of undue complacency. They run the risk of not being alert to all of the injustices in the world. And one of the great contributions of the radical tradition to modern experience has been to awaken our conscience again and again to injustice and persecution. And any liberal who did not pay attention to that would be foolish. It's one of the reasons why in the book I make a heroine out of Emma Goldman, who was no liberal, but is a great humanist. Not every humanist is a liberal, but every liberal has to be or try to be a humanist. But when you examine history, whether it's, and this is what I would say to your Adam, and I say it to my Luke, when you examine history, whether it's the immediate history just past of how we got rid of Trump, or it's the larger history of modern times, you find again and again that a faith in the slow incremental process of reform produced a better world, and an impatient belief in the necessity of radical and revolutionary change produced a worse world. I believe that that's what history will show you. And I believe that that's finally the most powerful argument, is the evidence of our own experience.
Okay, we have just 2 minutes, but I have the most challenging question at the end. You work for the one of the greatest American magazine, but a good journalism today is very much endangered by the digital revolution and their effects. And my last question is how to apply your idea of 1,000 small sanities to defend a good journalism.
It's such a big question and such a hard question, and I don't want to seem to be complacent about it. It presents a huge threat, and I have seen my own business, the world I know, ripped apart by the digital age, which promised to democratize information and instead has atomized it in so many ways. Let me, though, speak to my own immediate experience again, which is what liberals should always do, and see how 1,000 Small Sanities works in that way. And I would call it 1,000,000 small subscribers. You know, the New Yorker, the magazine to which I have devoted my adult life, I've been there 35 years. I feel more a citizen than an employee of the New Yorker. Used to depend on advertisers. That's how we made our money. That's how we made a profit. We would deliver readers to wealthy advertisers who would then have advertising. That no longer works as a model. So what do we do now? We have a very smart editor, David Remnick, and he moved us towards a subscription model. So now the New Yorker has 1,000,000 small subscribers, and that's who supports us. The magazine is supported by almost exclusively by its subscribers. And we've gone on seeing how much we can raise the price of a subscription, right? And still sustain the magazine. So far, so good, right? We're able to pool enough money from our subscribers to support the livelihoods of people like me and all the political journalists to do their work. That's a model, it seems to me, going forward of something sane, of 1,000 small sanities through 1,000,000 small subscriptions. Now, I know we're very lucky to be able to make that model work. By no means can every publication work that way. My friends in France are suffering terribly from the crisis of journalism there. But I do believe that those models of small gatherings and consolidation of people who care are the way forward.
Okay, Adam Gopnik, the author of Thousand Small Sanities, was our guest. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining us today.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and all of my greetings to everyone in Poland. My hope is to be there soon.
Thank you very much.